First off, I want to apologize. I'm not as prepared as I usually am for recording, but this had to get recorded. Usually I have at least 1 to 4 pages written up as a report, so we can go off it. You've heard both Matt and I read, but this week I had some complications from my bariatric surgery over a year ago, and it was very difficult to concentrate. It's fine now. It's fine. I just needed some heavy-duty antacids, and we are going to do an asylum.
Yes, Utica.
Utica Asylum. We chose this over one that's even more well-known in the state of New York, because this one has a much richer history. It's maybe not as well-known. In other words, you're not going to find ghost hunters on TV coming to the Utica mental asylum. They're going to go to this other place. Right. But as I was researching between the two and trying to decide what we could do for this season, Utica won out because of the history of the place. Welcome to Unearthly Upstate. I'm Mari.
And I'm Matthew.
And like I said in the intro, or Matt said originally, we were talking about the Utica Asylum, Utica State Hospital, or it is commonly known as the Old Main.
Right.
But should we do our housekeeping first and thank some people?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I mentioned a podcast in the last episode, couldn't remember the name of it. It's called Mysteries and Monsters. And it is a very good podcast. The man does amazing interviews with people involved in cryptozoology, for people involved in the paranormal. It's not your typical interviews. He's interviewed like game wardens from Australia. He's interviewed other pretty big names in the research of that. So if you're into the cryptozoology and the paranormal, I highly recommend his. Just for the people he brings on and does the interviews with, they're very interesting to listen to. And from a historical standpoint, like the Australian game warden, he went into a lot of the history of where the Yowies came from and the legends and that. So that made it very interesting to me, and how it was tied up with colonialism in Australia and everything. Right. So even if you're not really into the paranormal, that some of these guests are so well versed in a lot of things you may find interesting. So I want to
he has a lot of authors, people who claim to be first-hand witnesses.
Yeah, but these
in
are
their
people
experiences
really,
with cryptids.
But they're not just some Joe Blow you meet down the bar. These people have spent some time researching and everything as well. So, which is nice.
And some people who aren't even looking for cryptids.
Yeah.
Such as in the case of the game warden from Australia.
Yeah, it just kind of kept happening to him, folks. So.
He wasn't looking for this thing. He wasn't a cryptid fan, by any stretch. In a very practical vocation, as a game warden in Australia, you can imagine how hard a job like that can be. Yeah. You're not thinking about, am I going to, run across a wild man today or something, out there in the bush. That's not what's on your mind as a gamekeeper. So his caliber interviews are much different. Exactly.
That's what we're trying to say.
Yeah, he has absolutely experts, authors, people who bring their own experience as experts and authors, to the realm of cryptids. Yeah. So, and what was that name again?
It's called Mysteries and Monsters.
Mysteries and Monsters.
So, shout out to that. Along with that, we were just at a Smithsonian Day event, and we went to the Genesee County Museum. Go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go. Place is amazing. I saw recommendations to spend 3 hours there. We were there for 3 hours, and we want to go back. We know we didn't see everything.
We were on the coupon day. We got in for free. Yeah. And there were hundreds of people there. They must have had a couple thousand people there by noon. But
it is the largest living history museum in New York State. If you really love the history end, there is a place to go. Many of the homes are originals and were moved there. They have George Eastman's boyhood home. There they have this beautiful octagon house, which is tied to New York spiritualism.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting.
And the Fox sisters.
Yeah, it was very interesting to talk to the docent there. We made a lot of good connections there. The people who work there and the volunteers that work there are really, really on the ball and really know what they're talking about. So go ahead and pick their brains. I highly recommend it.
Yes.
We had a great time. Like I said, we want to go back again. I'm sure there's more things we missed.
Yeah, there's some very knowledgeable people there who
yeah.
weren't necessarily volunteers, but also they're they're not exactly first interp people.
Yeah.
But they are very knowledgeable, and they are employees. They do get paid to do this sort of thing.
Right.
So it's a lot different than going to a place where you've got knowledgeable volunteers.
But everyone's full of passion.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I think that's it for housekeeping. Other than like and share. Anyway.
Unfortunately, we didn't get over to the site of Sam Patch's death.
Oh yes. We were going to go to the site of Sam Patch's death at the Genesee Falls, but the Genesee Brewery was having a special event, and all the parking spots that were close to the falls were taken up for the special event. So that's on our bucket list for later. Maybe we should go closer to the time he actually made the jump, so it'll be sometime in October. And,
okay. Absolutely.
And really experience it. But we were going to go pay our respects to Sam Patch, basically. And, without further ado, let's go to Utica. And let's talk about... I did write up a little bit, so I'm going to talk about the intro here. So, like I said, this is one of the few asylums that we can talk about that is still active today. Although now it is used for archive storage for the New York State Office of Mental Health, not for the treatment of the mentally ill. The patients are now treated in more modern buildings on the same campus. But the large cottage plan style asylum was New York State's first facility to treat the mentally ill. Remember, at this point, you had a lot of poor farms. You also had other hospitals, and they just kind of threw everybody together. You had the mentally ill, you had the criminals, you had the people who were poor, you had the developmentally ill.
Threw everyone together.
They just threw everyone together.
A general population.
This hospital in Utica was set up just for the mentally ill.
Okay.
It was, I think, the second in the United States, or it might have been the third in the United States. It was one of the first. This place was pretty infamous at the time, and it's still sort of infamous. There is still reports of hauntings there now, but it's kind of mundane, probably because the building is still in use. Orbs, ghostly faces that can be seen out of the windows, and just a general feeling of sadness. But I think if you go to any asylum that's not being used, you get a general feeling of sadness, okay? Now, compare this to the other old asylums in New York who still claim to be haunted. The Old Main seems to be a disappointment. But that does not mean the Utica State Hospital deserves to be ignored. The Utica Psychiatric Hospital, also known as the Utica State Hospital, also known as the Old Main, it opened in 1843. The Greek Revival building was designed by Captain William Clark. The hospital was funded by state and contributions raised by Utica residents, and at the time, it was the most state-of-the-art facility in the United States. Again, we're kind of rehashing the same story over and over again with these asylums. They're always built the best intentions. They're always built as a state-of-the-art. None of these places...
Greek Revival.
None of these places were ever built like, we are going to torture patients. No. There's always very good intentions behind this. First one built in New York State, but also the second one built in the United States. Its reputation soon became known countrywide. If you seemed upset or behaving strangely, someone may suggest to you that you need to take a trip to Old Main. And one famous person almost made that trip.
Oh, yes.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe, yeah.
His friends were suggesting that he possibly should book a trip to Utica and spend some time at Old Main. I don't know if he snapped himself out of it or what happened, but he didn't go. But he came very close to going.
They had stated that he had become deranged. And friends wanted him to be placed in charge of the doctors there.
Yes. Yeah.
At the retreat at Utica.
At the retreat, another euphemism.
Exactly, yes.
Now, the interesting thing is, Utica State Hospital is known for some treatments. Now, one thing that came up in my research was somebody stated that it was the first place to use the straitjacket. Wrong. The straitjacket was invented a century earlier in France, I believe. I'll have to look it up, but I think it was France.
You can check us on that if you want.
For inmates, criminal inmates, as punishment. Did make the transition over to the mental asylums, but it was not developed at the Utica facility. There is an infamous piece of restraint that was developed there, and it even shares the name. Yes. And that's called the Utica crib. Cage beds had been used prior to that, and a cage bed is exactly what it sounds like. It's a bed with a cage on it.
Cage around it.
Cage around it. They are still being used. Quite recently, I think it was 2005, I want to say it's Kosovo, what came under fire when pictures came out of one of their mental asylums in which they still were using caged beds. And I'm sorry to say this, but I would rather be in a Utica crib than their caged beds, because their caged beds were cots with chain link fence around them. That, to me, was more disturbing than the Utica crib, which was a cot that looked like a crib along the sides, but then had a top that also covered it with the wood slats. There are varying degrees of that. The Utica crib was usually shorter than the rest, so it was you didn't have as much room going up. You couldn't sit up in it. You could only lay down in it. I do know there's some mental illnesses, some developmental issues, some behavioral issues in which an enclosed place like that actually is comforting to people. But that's not for everybody. And that would often exasperate the problem. There are a few that even the Utica crib would be too spacious for them. They need to be enclosed more.
Agoraphobics, I think.
Some autistics. They need like a weighted blanket. I know people with anxiety, some of them find weighted blankets will calm them down. For some of them, being in this enclosed place would work, but it still looks like a cage. There's that feeling of being in a cage, I think, would really, really upset people. It took the place, and it was developed by the first director, whose name was Dr. Amara Bigman. He really focused on farming. Again, we talked about Letchworth Village, which also focused on farming. When I was researching this, the gardens of the Utica State Hospital were mentioned to be one of the best horticultural design for one of these hospitals. There were other things. There were other buildings on the campus. There was a clothing shop, a library, parlors, a slaughterhouse, because they did farm and grow their own food and raise their own food, and a theater. This guy also developed the crib. And some people, like I say, falsely say the straitjacket was developed there. Straitjacket was not. It was probably used there. It was very commonly used at that time. But an interesting thing that was also done there, and you can go on Google Books and find copies of this, is a publication called The Opal, O-P-A-L. What made this one interesting is the Opal was written and edited and printed by the patients of the Old Main.
Yeah, how about that? They have their own newspaper.
I don't know of any other asylum at the time would have given the inmate, I'm not sure if they're called patients or inmates in here, that much freedom and creativity.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting to read. The poems that are in there. The stories of, the governor's entourage came through, and it's a very interesting insight into it. Now, that was also the idea of Dr. Brigham. He was a firm believer in the curative value of mental occupation. So he wanted these patients to be active mentally. Oh, yeah. And what a better way to do it than this type of creativity.
Well, Brigham had included several pieces of patient writing in his American Journal of Insanity, which was also produced in the printing office of the institution.
It also contained illustrations done by the patients as well, so that was kind of interesting. There's an example one. This one was quoted, I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's a bunch, but this was republished from the Disability History Museum. I'm just going to read a paragraph from this. And remember, this was written by a patient. First day. Dear friend, you asked me to give you life in the asylum. It does not differ much from life out of the asylum. Pray take my eye and view the hall as I enter as a visitor. Passing from the entrance to the great building, you are ushered into the long dining room, which is lighted through a veranda of equal dimensions, overlooking the central square of the building. Projecting wings run backwards, and the rear of the building contain the printing office, the bakery, forming a square. You see busy men and women passing to and fro. It is in the central building you stand. From there are 2 side wings. A door is unlocked, and you enter the ladies' apartment. A long hall of over 200 feet in length, and perhaps 16 in breadth, is before you. A bow window down at the end lights the apartment. Ladies are seen gliding to and fro, rooms from which open on either side. You'll be kindly offered a place in one of these nice settees. A group surrounds you, kindly words of greeting meet you. All are busy and is in a home parlor. Some with a book, some with a needle. All look happy, in neat and becoming attire. The rich and poor meet here without livery or pride, each maintaining true self-respect. For each is content and helps bear the burden of the other. To the spirit of goodness is allotted the highest seat, and grace here abounds. Wow. That is quite flowy, lovely language about it.
Uh-huh.
But that gives you an example of what they were writing about in there. So on one hand, you had the Utica crib. Mm-hmm. And then you had this very progressive thing of, well, it's art therapy, isn't it?
Right.
Basically. You know, they're writing, they're drawing.
Sure, creative writing.
Creative writing.
The ghosts, where do the legends of, what are the particular ghosts and haunting legends of parts of the Utica Hospital? I mean, because I have to say certain parts because it's still being used as a hospital.
It is, yeah. The building itself, Old Main, is just now basically an archive dump. That's where they put all the paperwork in it. But people do say that there are still ghosts in there. Let me see. There is a good example of it about how a lot of people come up to that site, swear they see people in the windows, even though now the Old Main isn't. I mean, yes, it's still being used. There's just not hundreds of people in there anymore. You might be seeing somebody walking by a window. Okay, but what if it's like at 9 o'clock at night?
Yeah. Because
you remember, we drove up to it. It is easy to get to in Utica once you see it, you know where you're at. It's no...
Oh, yeah.
There's no denying it. Can you tour it? Certain times of the year you can tour it. They open it up. Mm-hmm. And the lines are long. Yeah, they usually take from 4 or 5 hours. You plan to be in that line for at least 2 hours when they open it up. Yeah.
Long time.
But yeah, people do still swear that they see things. There have been ghost investigators in there who swear they have EVP recordings. But for the most part, compared to other asylums in New York, and compared to especially a few that are making their money on hauntings, it's pretty benign what you run into. It's more of a place really to study the history of mental illness treatment. It did stay open until 1978. Was it overcrowded? Probably. I don't hear the horror stories like you heard in Letchworth. I don't hear, the stories of people being ignored because they didn't have the staff. From what I read, I could be wrong. From what I read, it sounded more like the building was outliving its usefulness as a treatment area. They had these more modern buildings on the campus that could be better for treatment. And a lot of the people that were hospitalized didn't need to be hospitalized anymore. Treatments had changed. You weren't going to hospitalize somebody for depression now. You had pharmaceuticals that could help them. You weren't going to necessarily, if somebody had anxiety, necessarily hospitalize them anymore. That's not to say there aren't people who still need to be hospitalized. I mean, there is just a few miles down the road, there's Central Psych, which that is one of the more heavy-duty psychiatric hospitals in New York State. But it's all, the treatment had changed from when it started. Patients weren't expected to go out and grow and raise their own food. I don't see why they couldn't have a garden, but,
Right, exactly.
And therapy animals do work. All right, so what I was trying to find was another example of writing by the inmate, by a patient there, and one is Dental Philosophy, Learning to Draw, and it's a poem written by a patient. They don't give him credit, though, who it is. They do some, but not this one. Hold fast the tongs, and I'll hold the head. You hear no groans, the calf is dead. You came no pain, you caused no pains, no heaving sight, no flowing blood, no rolling eyes. As when with toothache, nature dies. No gums to cot, all bare and prongs. So do not fate, hitch on the tongs. Be sure you're right, then go ahead, and draw each grinder from its bed. Oh, ghost of bush, and shade of cales, did ye sich funny pullin'? 'Tis the best way to impart a thorough knowledge of the art. See, they speak highly of dentists back then. All right. So yeah, this is an example. Like I said, I got this right off of Google Books, and
well, you got all these writings from the patients, but you don't have any credit.
Some of them were credited.
Some of them were.
So I wonder if the ones who weren't credited put the stuff in anonymously.
Well, they may have. Well, I'm wondering if I'm looking at the same thing. I'm looking at Google Drive.
Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to the Utica crib. Mm-hmm. It was a more humane way of restraining patients. I mean, the straitjacket, like I said, was about 100 years prior. So, and the straitjacket is still being used in many respects. When I was doing research for this, I actually came across a few suppliers of medical restraints, and they had some that are now considered more humane. The problem I have with them is I really don't see the difference between strapping people to the bed using the cloth straps. I understand why. Okay, I'm not one of these people that say, you can't restrain everyone. No, there are times where people may be under the influence of drugs, maybe the influence of not being under the right drugs, can lash out and become harm to themselves and other people.
People are having a violent, psychotic episode.
So I don't think you'll ever get rid of the restraints, especially in the psychiatric field, because there are times it might be the only way to stop somebody from harming themselves. It might be the only way to, calm down somebody. Like I said, there's people with anxiety that find weighted blankets work well in calming them down. And there are some modern restraints I've seen, which basically is a cot with a heavy weighted blanket on you, and then they put the straps over in case you're having one of those real psychotic episodes. Mm-hmm. And like I said, there are some people where that is calming for them, because that weight but it's a weight over the complete body. It's not, being shackled or anything. You're just basically tightly bound up. That sounds weird. It's like with babies when you wrap them up, when you swaddle them. Yeah, it's the same idea. It's to give them that comfort.
Okay.
But there are still the chain and handcuff restraints that are used. So I want you to imagine when the Utica crib was developed, and it was developed off other caged beds at the time. A very common restraint was the iron shackles.
Right.
And to shackle you around the ankles, to shackle you around the wrist, to shackle you around the neck, to restrain you that way. It's a very common form. So what did seem more humane? Shackling somebody to iron and chains, or putting them in this crib? I mean, there's no other term for it. It's a crib. It's a crib with a wooden slats on the top. I have seen versions of the cage bed where they have a rope top. So I don't know if that's even any better. The chain link ones, I saw them. Oh my God, those I think were the worst. And I was thinking, okay, if this person is being put in this bed because they're afraid they're going to lash out, Or maybe during the night they have severe nightmares, they have night terrors, and they, thrash about. Chain link fence, to me, is worse than the wooden one. Because you could injure yourself on that chain link fence. I mean...
definitely.
I mean, I did see older versions of the cage bed that came out after the Utica crib, and where they switched to a rope situation. Yeah.
So the Utica crib was named after the United States lunatic asylum in Utica, where it was heavily used in the 19th century to confine patients. And the crib was based on a French design that then modified to incorporate slats and give it an appearance similar to a child's crib. While use of the Utica crib was widely criticized and infamous among the patients, some found it to have an important therapeutic value. A patient who slept in the Utica crib for several days commented that he had rested better and found it more useful for all crazy fellows, quote, as I, whose spirit is willing, but those whose flesh is weak, end quote.
Where'd you get that one from? I'm just curious.
It's from the one of the notes.
Okay, we'll have it in our sources. Because this one too was talking a little bit more about it. It was the patients that they would put in the crib suffered from such things like epilepsy, overworking, masturbation, sexual fervor, impropriety, nervous shaking, war trauma, and, quote, women's issues, unquote.
Women's issues, that covers a lot of that.
We could have a whole podcast.
And you could go up the list from there.
Oh my gosh. Okay, the epilepsy, I can understand. You want them, if they have a severe fit, you want them in a contained spot where they're not going to injure themselves. Of course, I think at this time, people were trying to restrain epileptics, whereas now it's like, let them just get everything dangerous away from them.
Yeah, because you cause more injury
if you try to restrain them.
If you attempt to restrain a person who's going through an epileptic seizure. So
overworking.
Okay, what's that in reference to?
I have no idea. It just says overworking. So
is that from stress?
If it's stress, maybe sleeping in one of those beds would be kind of nice.
You're not only a danger to other people, but I think it's an opportunity to be a danger to somebody who's locked in one of those. Yeah. I can see where. What was the situation under which you were locked into the crib? Were you mixed with the general population when you were locked in this thing, or were you isolated in a separate room?
I'm not sure.
Because I think it would be an opportunity for another, another inmate to come up there and poke them with a stick or something.
Well, yeah. I mean, you are, and I'm sure they didn't try to use it for punishment, but I bet it was.
Yeah.
And it had to be.
Yeah, but they did in lieu of isolating them in another cell.
We can pretty much put masturbation, sexual fervor, and impropriety all together and really like that. That's like the whole idea of that has totally changed. Okay, we won't go into that.
Oh, I did when I looked up Utica crib. Yeah. A lot of associated type of restraints came up as suggestions, and a lot of these anti-masturbation devices were pretty cruel.
Yep.
There's basically a chastity belt, a metal chastity belt that got locked around the patient, and you basically just had holes to wee out of.
Ugh. Nervous shaking. That's pretty broad. I mean,
nervous shaking.
Nervous shaking. Could that have been somebody who was starting to suffer from, some sort of tremors, maybe from recovering from alcoholism? Could that have been, as you get older, you may develop the tremors as well. I mean, there are a lot of things that can cause shaking. War trauma. PTSD.
Yeah.
In the Utica crib, I can't see the Utica crib being much use for somebody suffering from PTSD.
I think it would, I think it would really, I think it would rather make it worse if you try to forcibly restrain somebody inside one of these who was suffering from PTSD. It would probably.
Yeah, and of course the women issues,
probably make their episode worse.
The women's issues, we could do a whole episode on women's issues.
What?
Well, maybe that should be one that me and my friend Zoe, who are developing another podcast, by the way, hint, hint, it will come.
Look at the terms that they were using at the time. They weren't even known as psychiatrists or psychologists, rather.
Right. Well, that didn't start until the 20th century, really.
I take psychologists over psychiatrists any day. But anyway, they were known as alienists.
Yeah. Wow.
They weren't even...
Wow.
Where you would find that out? Yeah.
But the misuse of the Utica crib came about because, okay, let's say you were admitted because you had nervous shaking. Maybe you were developing Parkinson's. They didn't know what Parkinson's was.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they stick you in this bed, and because you're shaking all the time, they don't let you get out of that bed. You could be in there for the rest of your life.
Be in there for days, or months, or yes.
Yeah, it was so.
What are the accounts?
And then
people, are there accounts of people?
There are accounts of people dying
in them.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the one at Utica State Hospital itself, but like I said, it really had to deal with what they thought mental illness was at the time. You remember watching The Madness of King George?
Yeah.
They would restrain him every time he had an outburst.
The restrainment chair.
Yeah. So if that was considered one way to treat the mentally ill, there was some very progressive things that doctor was doing. Such as
through occupational therapy.
Occupational therapy and all this. We're talking about 1700s here. But yeah, the king would have an outburst and he was immediately put in that chair. And this chair would strap everything down. His head was strapped down, his body was strapped down until his outburst was done. Which at the time was, wow, this is groundbreaking. Look what we can control their behavior. Mm-hmm. But are you really working on what is causing that behavior?
I think it's just, they're trying to slap a Band-Aid on it maybe. But, at this time, at the time that happened, when treatments of the mentally ill were very different. It's true they didn't understand mental illness as well maybe as we do today. And of course, many of the treatments are seen as brutal. Mm-hmm. But it was a time when they thought that people could just snap out of it. Yeah. Somehow. Yeah. And this is the way we help
today.
Well, exactly. Yeah. You still get people referring to other people as nervous. When they want to say that they're crazy.
When you suffer from depression and you're having a good day and you're happy, people think, oh, you're cured.
Yeah.
But depression is a chemical imbalance in your brain. It's not something you can just switch on and off. Mm-hmm. There's a good example where people get a misconception of what, people who suffer from severe anxiety, it's not them behaving that way because they're trying to avoid things. They want to be involved. It's just their anxiety gets to the point that anxiety is controlling them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it has to do with chemical imbalances. I mean, we have made, far advancements in mental illness, but there's still that attitude like, oh, they're just avoiding things. They don't want to do anything. They're scared. Well, no, they want to do stuff. They don't want to not be able to work because they're so anxious and leaving the house. That's not normal. And that's not a choice. When you're depressed and you have a good day, you still have depression. It's just you're having a good day. I mean, there's a lot there too. And then you can talk about the developmental disabilities, which there's been a lot of. We really have worked on that. Just think about Asperger's and autism. How that for what I know they don't classify Asperger's separately anymore. It's considered high functioning autism. Right. But for the longest time, that was just the weird kid.
Yeah, Dr. Asperger, who was an Austrian doctor back in 1943, discovered it, helping pin down what autism is and a greater definition of what autism is. Yeah. Came out of his study. And that's where the term Asperger's, was coined after Dr. Asperger.
Right.
And
so we've made.
I think it's interesting that sort of development in the definition and treatment of psychology came out of a place like 1943. Came out of 1943's Austria.
As horrible as we look back at these asylums now,
sort of thing.
There were a lot of strides. I mean, we mentioned Letchworth Village, Granted, morally it may have been wrong, but that polio vaccine came out of it.
Yeah.
Morally, how it came about, that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, people who wanted to protect civil rights.
Now, here's the thing: is the old Maine, which was, developed for just mentally insane people. Before that was created, we talked about the poor farms.
Yeah. If
you were lucky. You went to a poor farm.
if you were lucky.
A lot of times it was mom and dad lock you away in your family locks you away in a room and nobody talks about that relative. We talked about that before.
You're locked in the attic and fed a bucket of fish heads a week.
Oh, God. It just basically put them away and forget about them.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't do anything. So here's a facility that at least was trying to treat them. They had no idea what they were doing. It's like when we were learning how to do farming, we were T-panning, or how do you call it? That way, put a hole in your head.
Trepanning. Yeah.
Yeah, to relieve pressure from headaches.
To let out the demons. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so
well, inadvertently, that's what they were doing.
Yeah,
was relieving pressure on
if you look at any type of medical treatment, there were times where it was very barbaric. Yeah. Look at where pharmaceuticals came from. And now you look at some of the herbal remedies that were used, some people might still use without fully understanding what they're doing, that could kill you.
Yeah.
But if they were taken in a certain amount, but nobody really knew how to regulate that, they would be helpful. And that's where you get the pharmacy separates from the herbals, and then homeopathy. Let's not go into that. They also tried to give these people purpose. Like I said before, a lot of them were locked away. A lot of them were, thrown out in the streets and not cared for. And now they had a purpose, and it may be, hey, you're growing the tomatoes this year. Or we're going to teach you how to bake, and you can make bread for everyone. Trying to do something other than just, let's lock them away. You got to think in that time period, this was impressive. People were given clothing to wear. Big one right there. Well, we just saw a Revolutionary War encampment, and I think it surprised some of the people when they were given the talk about the fact that that uniform was all you had.
Yeah.
Being in one of these hospitals and having clean clothes, wow. Even the soldiers weren't getting the clean clothes. I'm sure it was starting to change about the time you all made, the Civil War. I'm not sure how many uniforms a Civil War soldier got.
Well, yeah, you only got one. You only got one kit.
Yeah.
But you could request replacements, though, from the quartermaster. You say you had a pair of shoes, pair of brogans worn out, you need new shoes. That could be requested by your commanding officer. Everything could be replaced. So that was in the Union Army. However, in the Southern Army, not so much. You see in some, I probably mentioned this in other podcasts as well. You see guys who encamp and they've got their shoes off, marching around during drill. Well, that's so that they can preserve their shoes for the winter, and they don't wear them out during the summer. And at the end, you've only got maybe maybe two pairs of socks to go with that. So, and that's it. Yeah. That's for the whole campaign.
And so now these patients are actually getting better deals.
You do get a better logistical supply at these institutions, presumably.
There's an interesting,
you would in the military.
Interesting bit here I just found in the notes that in the 1850s, people go to asylums now. They go for the ghost hunting. They go for you go to Alcatraz to hear about how the prisoners lived. This tourism idea was not new. I knew this, but in the 1850s, Old Maine was a tourist attraction. People come and gawk at the patients. This was also very common in England as well. Bellamy, I believe it was, you'd come in and they would actually, antagonize the patients for the entertainment of the crowds that were coming in.
Yeah.
This wasn't anything new. I'm not sure if that's what they did in the Old Main. It was probably more of, let's just go look at the crazies and gawk at them, And eventually that was stopped. That was in 1850.
Otherwise, you could pay 2 bits at the door and go look at the crazies.
Yes, yeah.
The original haunted house.
That was a very common form of entertainment, really. Mm-hmm. And, that's what you did on a date. Hey, let's go check out the nuts. I don't think they call them nuts. Let's go check out the infirm or whatever.
Terms they would use.
Yeah.
Let's go view the nervous. That sort of thing.
Like I said, at the time, it tried to be very progressive. It tried to, really promote treatment.
Okay.
Again, the treatment was, we're kind of grasping at straws here. We have really no idea what we're doing.
Yeah.
But they hoped things would work.
We're sure this might help with masturbation and women's issues, but we're not really sure until we give it a try.
Before it became a tourist attraction, though, there was a fire there.
Let's talk about the deaths and the accidents and the incidents.
The fire killed a firefighter and a doctor. They went in to try to save some records that had been about the treatment. But that fire was used as fodder by publications like New York Times that basically said, there's no way you can cure mental illness. That fire was started by a patient.
Well, they have no idea what the origins of the fire was.
Well, apparently it was a former patient who was now an employee of the place started it. I'm not sure if he started it on purpose or people blamed him for it, but he was the one blamed.
Scapegoat?
He was a scapegoat. I've read 2 different stories about it. Some people think he did start on purpose because even though he was employed there, he still ticked at the place. And
probably stuck in that crib.
And other people think it was an accident. He was just used as a scapegoat. But regardless...
That's probably more likely.
Regardless, it was used as an example that you can't cure these people. You can't cure them.
What New York paper was that?
New York Times.
Oh, it would be. I wouldn't use that if it was the last paper in the house.
Oh, gee. It's a fine, standing newspaper. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, it's, like I said, the history of it's very interesting. And it's still being used. Not for treatment anymore.
No.
No, those patients have gone off to other places. And that's why you can't just show up there and take a tour. They do open it up every so often. I didn't see any listed this year. I could be wrong. They may have had a tour. But I do remember the last time we tried to go, I ended up working that night. But they were talking about on the news at the line, you were waiting 2 hours just to get tickets.
Oh my goodness.
And they only open it like a couple times a year and only for a few hours. So you better be first in line if you want to see the inside. And it's a good historical tour. I mean, there are examples of it online.
If you're interested in the history of the treatment of the infirm.
Is it haunted? Probably just like every asylum.
Faces in the windows.
Yeah, it's probably haunted just like every asylum. There's that definite feeling of sadness that you get with every one of them.
You get that with any hospital.
Well, yeah.
Because that's us, though. That's our mental image of it. The people who are inside for treatment, quote unquote, have got a different view of it. And, to some of those people, it might be the place they want to be, or need to be. And people looking at it from the outside see it as something negative, as a place where it's a place to be feared, to be sent to.
Right.
Because they know what's going on over there. Many of these treatments are pretty intrusive or downright cruel. And people, there's that element of fear that it just casts a pall over the whole building. And and the story is very much like all the other, all the other asylum stories that we've covered in the past already, and much of the same kind of ghost stories as well.
Producer Lloyd is rubbing up against me and Matt, so if you hear anything odd, that's him. I think he's hinting at us to hurry up. But we should probably wrap this up. But every asylum, it seems like, goes to the same story. It's they build it because there's a need, and they try to be progressive, and they try to be forward-thinking in their treatment, and then through overcrowding, lack of funding, misunderstanding of the treatment, probably because no one's really explored real treatment at this point. Patients get abused, patients get neglected, things escalate, and then eventually you get into the later half of the 20th century, and they start getting closed because they're looked upon as being barbaric, or in the case of the Utica, the Old Main, just there was better options than the treatment at the Old Main.
Right.
Or now. It did close before the big rush to close them all with Reagan. That happened in the 80s, so it beat the rush in that respect.
Well, a lot of those institutions were failing.
Yeah.
But the institutions that functioned were getting closed along with them.
And so one thing you can take away from there is, yes, the Utica Crib came out of the Utica, Maine. The Opal came out of the Utica, Maine, which is it's an interesting read. I recommend people, if you want to look into what the patients thought. It's an interesting read. But they did not invent the straitjacket there.
No.
It was used there, but it was not invented.
And as far as ghost stories go,
pretty benign. So there you go. There's a little bit of history. The first asylum for the mentally ill in New York was in Utica. Yeah, and we already did the housekeeping for this week. And
thank you to all our listeners.
Yes.
Everywhere, wherever you may be.
And we're taking 3 weeks off after this.
Oh, that's right.
You'll be able to hear some of our Patreon podcasts. We're going to release them to the public in the next 3 weeks. Main reason we're doing this is because Matt has a job during the month of October.
Yes, I'm
scaring people.
I'm working at Demon Acres in Hannibal, New York. Yes.
He's not in the dining room anymore, folks, but...
No, they offered me a different position.
Thanks for listening to our Unearthly Podcast.
Yes, thanks for listening to our Ghastly Podcast.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Unearthly Upstate. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, and on our webpage. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Podcasts, and CastBox. Please like, share, and review on your favorite platform. Unearthly Upstate is an Animator Liar production. The show is produced by Mari and Matt Manette, with purring provided by Honey and Lloyd. Research and writing by Mari Manette. Music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. Unless otherwise stated in the episode, the places mentioned in the broadcast are not paid or contact us for any type of promotion. Please check out our webpage for credit and sources for the episode. Thank you.